How's it going, everybody? Today we're looking at the Cold War in Asia. So last week we looked at Latin America as one of the hot spots of the Cold War, one of the regions in which the Cold War impacted life. Today we're going to be taking a trip to Asia. Now, we will be glossing over a few things here, like the Chinese Communist Revolution. We'll talk about it, but we're going to be talking about it very surface level. That's fine. We'll come back, we'll look at it later after this unit as a separate unit, so don't worry about that too much. Okay, all you need to know is that China does become communist and some basic information. Same thing with Korea. You'll learn much more about Korea and Vietnam next year in U.S. history, so this is meant to just be kind of an overview to get the main idea. Okay, so here we go, Asia. Alright, so real quick, just if you're wondering, why are we learning this? Okay, well, these are still all very relevant things, right? The government of Vietnam today is still the descendant of the Vietnamese government that was set up during this time period. Vietnam is still technically a communist country, although things have loosened up a lot and are different than the government that originally was set up as communist. Okay? Korea was split into two countries, North and South, and they are still split into two countries, North and South, and they've definitely been in the news a lot, and so that's very relevant. And then the Korean and Vietnam Wars were some of the biggest armed conflicts of the Cold War. So even though the Cold War was a Cold War with supposedly less fighting, if you look at Korea and Vietnam, it was anything but a Cold War. It was a very, very hot war. A lot of fighting, a lot of death. So we're going to be looking at this for these reasons. We're not going to get to Vietnam just today. We'll get to it next week. That's okay. Alright, so let's look at China first. China becomes communist. So, let's get that. Alright, so here we get to China post-World War II. Let me go back for a second real quick as a quick reminder. So, if you guys remember, we have the fall of the Qing dynasty as they become ineffective, essentially. Okay? China then kind of breaks up into this warring warlords period in which different people are fighting over control of China. Then there is the first revolution, in 1911, in which the first sort of democratic government of China is set up. Okay? However, despite some early successes, once Sun Yat-sen, who was sort of the founder and kind of father of this democratic China, once he passes away, then China devolves back into civil war. And the civil war is between Chiang Kai-shek, or Jiang Jieshi, who was the leader of the nationalist Chinese government. Okay, so non-communist. He was supported by the U.S., the upper class. And then Mao Zedong, who was the leader of the communist government. And he was supported by the peasant class. He himself had been a peasant. And he wanted to spread the communist revolution in China. So they start fighting each other in the 1920s. Then in the 1930s, Japan invades, right? In 1931, they invade Manchuria. In 1937, there's the rape of Nanking. And so the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and the communists under Mao Zedong, they kind of patch things up, for the kids. They get together like, all right, let's stop fighting each other. Let's help each other out. Let's fight the Japanese. They're the real enemies. So they help each other out, and they fight the Japanese. However, during World War II, the communists were actually much, much better at fighting the Japanese than the nationalists. In fact, the nationalists were the ones who were blamed, in part, for the rape of Nanking, because they were the ones defending the city, and many of the soldiers fled the city before the Japanese arrived, thus allowing the Japanese to kind of do what they did in Nanking. Now, would they have done differently had the soldiers been there? I don't know. But it definitely didn't look very good to the people of China when the nationalists were the ones that were kind of ditching them during this time of war, to some extent. Okay? So, eventually, World War II ends, right? The Civil War starts again. The communists and the nationalists start fighting each other. At this time, the nationalists are supported by the United States, right? Now the Cold War started. Remember, Truman, he said, we're going to support any nation resisting communism. Well, that meant backing Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. The nationalists, though, didn't have very good military leadership. They didn't have the same passion that the communists had to win. And in the end, the communists were victorious. And again, we'll talk more about this revolution later on. There's many more intricate events and details that are important to note. But for now, that's all you need to know. Okay? So, Chiang Kai-shek, he flees to Formosa, Taiwan. And then the People's Republic of China is formed in mainland China. Now, this is a very significant event for the Cold War because for the U.S., this was essentially the U.S. losing a battle of the Cold War, right? Losing a proxy war. Truman was criticized very heavily for, quote-unquote, losing China to communism. And so this kind of showed that the U.S. had to be much more aggressive in its containment if it hoped to contain communism. And so when we get to the battles, or the wars of Korea, of Vietnam, we'll see that the U.S. is going to be much, much more involved in those wars than they were in China. And many politicians in the U.S. are unwilling to back down because they saw Truman as having lost China as his undoing. The reason why he was no longer president after this. So, here's the map. China, Taiwan, obviously still a very contentious issue to this day, but we'll talk about that later. Alright, so let's turn our attention to Korea real quick. So, go back a second. So at this point, right, we have China under communist control, Taiwan under communist control, under nationalist, non-communist control. At this point, Korea was not South and North, it was just Korea. Okay, but at the end of World War II, right, the Soviets, they were working their way towards Japan, right, before the atomic bombs were dropped. And so they basically got to about half of Korea. So when the war ended, they still occupied the northern half of Korea. And then South Korea was not occupied, but was somewhat supported by the U.S. Okay, so Korean War. So, it was divided at the 30th parallel. Okay? At the north of the 30th parallel, those Japanese troops surrendered to the Soviets, and then the government that was set up was essentially a puppet government to some degree of the Soviets, right? In the south, those Japanese troops surrendered to the Americans, and therefore that government reflected what the Americans wanted. Okay? So, by 49, both the Soviet and American troops had mostly withdrawn, but the governments that were left there were still very much, in a sense, under the same ideology, or to a certain degree, puppets of those countries. Okay? The Soviets supplied North Korea with all the necessary weapons to attack South Korea and gain control over all of Korea. North Korea then attacked South Korea and pushed them basically all the way back into the southeastern portion of Korea. They were very, very close to winning this war. Truman was still president, right? And he essentially realized, hey, if I let Korea fall, just like China fell, I'm basically done, right? And this will essentially, potentially start World War III also, right? If we just let the Soviet Union kind of be like Hitler and do everything with appeasement, right? And so, he sends troops as well to Korea. So the UN basically is told, and remember the United Nations was created at this point as a replacement for the League of Nations. The UN basically says, okay, we're going to intervene, but the vast, vast majority of the troops and the command is American, under Douglas MacArthur. Okay? So, the communists, the North Koreans, had pushed the US and the South Koreans, pushed the South Koreans into this little portion right here, right? Then the US landed at Incheon, right here, on the western side of Korea, and started pushing the North Koreans back. First they recaptured the south, then they started pushing towards the north. Okay? They go almost all the way back to the Yalu River, over here, the border with China and North Korea. Well, the Chinese then got fearful that the U.S. were going to keep pushing into China and then conquer China. And so, they sent in about 350,000 quote-unquote volunteers to help out the North Koreans, but really essentially to push the Americans back. And so the Americans were pushed back to basically where the original line was, the 30th parallel, and that's where the two Koreas are split today, along this line right here. Technically speaking, this war is still going on, because a truce was signed in 1953, but no peace treaty was ever arrived at. So technically this is still a war that is going on, although it has been cold since 1953. Basically what I just said, right? They push the Americans back, ceasefire is called, and we end here. Now, this war cost 4 million lives. So when we think about the Cold War, yes, the fighting between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was cold for the very most part. However, there are many, many battles that were pretty much direct causes of the Cold War. Especially, I would say Korea is one of the ones that's very especially because of the Cold War, because of the Soviet Union and the U.S. Vietnam is a little more complicated. Vietnam was not 100% a part of the Cold War, and we'll talk about that next week. But the Korean War cost 4 million lives, and that kind of proves that the Cold War was a very, very important event in world history that must be paid attention to. Okay? Aftermath. So, North Korea remained a communist country. It still is today. The government did many of the typical communist things. Collectivization of farms, basically take away private property farms. You put farms into one big group, and then you say, okay, you guys all share now. Go. Right? But people lose their land, and if you're wealthy, you're probably going to get killed. They built up the military because they realized that they were going to be under constant threat, and so they built up a huge military, and they have a huge military. It might surprise you, but the North Korean army is actually bigger than the U.S. army in terms of standing numbers, right? Soldiers that are ready to go at a moment's notice. The North Koreans have a bigger army than the U.S. Obviously, the U.S. has a stronger military and bigger army if need be, but that is still kind of something that points to the size of the North Korean military machine. But they had serious economic problems, obviously. They were cut off from most of the world for trade, small piece of land. Their only real partners were China and the Soviet Union to a certain degree, and later on Vietnam when it became communist, right? So they were kind of limited in their economic opportunities. South Korea, right, while they were supported by the U.S., they were supporting a dictatorship. Okay, it wasn't a true democracy. Syngman Rhee was the dictator at the time. Later on, they would become a democratic country, and they would prosper much, much more economically due to foreign aid and, well, free enterprise, right? And nowadays, South Korea is one of the most developed countries in the world. But troops remained in South Korea, and they are still there, because there's a suspicion, it's probably true, that if those troops are removed, North Korea would invade the next day. And so it's still very much a very tense situation in North and South Korea at the time, currently. Ultimately, like I said, there was no real changes in land. 4 million people died, 54,000 American soldiers died, which is still a lot, right? The U.S. has always had a policy of limiting American lives being lost in war, and yet 54,000 were killed. $67 billion was the cost of the war, but this also gave the Republicans the 1952 election under Eisenhower, because both China and Korea were seen as losses for the U.S. And so Truman and the Democrats were basically said to have lost those wars. And so the voters then kind of reacted to that and elected Eisenhower, who would take a much more hardline approach in the 50s with Vietnam, and that kind of plays a very important role here, because this kind of questions the policy of containment. The question was, how much do you have to contain? How many troops and money do you have to pour into a country or a war to truly contain? And so when we get to Vietnam, the lessons of China and Korea are very important. So, answer these 3 questions on your Google Doc, and then you're done for today. Why did the U.S. get involved in China and Korea? How successful was containment in Asia? And how did the Korean War contribute to Cold War tensions? Okay? 3 to 5 sentences for each, please, and you're good to go. All right. Talk to you guys next week.